The dining room hummed with the clatter of plates and the murmur of late afternoon conversation. Richard Carver sat across from his son Nathan when the young man lowered his voice. "Dad, can you have dinner with us?" In the corner, a woman named Elena Hayes sat alone, a single bowl of soup before her, her eyes carrying a kind of quiet exhaustion she couldn't hide. Richard didn't answer. He stood up, and what he did next silenced the entire room and made his own son look at him differently forever. The rain had thinned to a slow drizzle by the time Richard Carver pulled into the gravel lot outside the Mason Diner on a Tuesday evening. He killed the engine and waited a moment before opening his door, the way a man does when he needs those 2 seconds to shift from work to whatever comes next. Nathan was already unbuckling his seatbelt beside him. 19 now, lean and quiet, back from his second year of college and still living in his old room because city rent was higher than reason allowed. They'd been coming to the diner once a week for nearly 6 years, since the funeral, since the house had stopped feeling like a place either of them wanted to have dinner. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee and sautéed onions. The booth by the window was free, as it usually was on weeknights, and Richard slid into it with the practiced ease of a regular. He ordered the meatloaf without looking at the menu, and Nathan ordered the same. Richard ran a small commercial real estate firm 2 towns over. Nothing flashy, but steady, built on 12 years of careful contracts and the firm habit of never owing anyone a favor. He balanced his checkbook every Sunday and refused to leave a problem unresolved past midnight. People in his office sometimes called him fair. They never called him warm. He decided long ago that warmth and clarity rarely fit in the same room. Nathan spotted her first. She was sitting at the two-top by the back wall, where the lighting was poorest, and her posture made it clear she'd chosen that seat for that reason. Brown hair pulled back in a bun that had loosened over the course of a long day. In front of her sat a single bowl of soup and a glass of tap water. Nothing else. She held the spoon carefully, the way a person holds something they want to last. Nathan turned to his father and lowered his voice. "Don't look right away. The woman behind you, 2 tables back." Richard waited half a minute, then reached for the salt shaker and let his eyes pass over her without stopping. He saw what Nathan had seen, the meagerness of the meal, the way she kept her purse pressed tight against her hip, like someone who'd learned not to set it on the floor. The exhaustion that was more than tiredness. He'd seen his late wife wear that same look in the months they were trying to figure out how to pay for treatment without going under. "She was at that table when we pulled into the lot," Nathan said. "I saw her through the window. She hasn't ordered anything else." Richard took his water glass and took a slow sip, keeping his voice even. "She came in to get out of the rain." "Maybe. But she didn't come in just for the rain." Richard didn't answer that. He turned his fork over once and put it back down. A part of him wanted to do what he always did in situations like this, which was nothing, not because he didn't care, but because caring without thinking it through was how a man ended up in other people's lives in ways he couldn't manage. He'd built his entire adult life on the principle that you helped your own and left strangers their privacy. That was the line. That was how the world worked. The waitress passed by the woman's table and asked if she wanted anything else. The woman shook her head and offered the kind of polite smile that meant the answer had been decided before the question was asked. Richard watched her hand drift briefly toward the side pocket of her bag. Then it came away empty, like she'd checked for something whose answer she already knew. She returned to her soup more slowly now, because the bowl was nearly empty and she had nowhere else to be. Nathan set his glass down softly. "Dad, can you have dinner with us?" That was the moment Richard had been both waiting for and dreading. He knew his son. He knew that when Nathan asked something in a low voice, it wasn't really a question, it was a measurement. Nathan was watching to see what kind of man his father was when no one important was looking. And Richard had spent enough years trying to be that man not to fail the test. Now, on a Tuesday over a bowl of soup, Richard kept his face still. "It's not that simple," he said. Nathan's voice was soft but firm. "It's a meal. It's not complicated." Richard answered without looking up. "You don't know her situation." Nathan's reply came just as low. "That's why I'm asking." Richard let out a breath through his nose. The rational part of him, the part that had run his business through a recession without missing a payroll, began running through the angles like he always did. She might feel embarrassed. She might feel insulted. She might think he was hitting on her. She might decide he was looking at her like a charity case, which, if he was honest, was partially true. There were 8 ways this could go wrong and only 1 or 2 where it could go right. And that wasn't the kind of math he usually bet on. But Nathan was still watching, and the woman in the corner had just finished her soup. She was tilting the bowl now, bringing the last spoonfuls toward her, and in another minute or 2 she'd set the spoon down and leave. Whatever Richard was going to do, he had less time than he wanted, and the diner kept moving around him like none of this mattered. He set his napkin on the table. "Wait here," Richard said. He stood up. The diner continued its course. Forks against plates. A country song playing through the speaker over the kitchen. A man 2 booths over laughing at something on his phone. No one noticed him cross the room. He walked between the tables with his hands loose at his sides, the way someone walks into a negotiation, except this wasn't a negotiation, and he was aware of that with every step. He stopped at a polite distance from her table. She looked up, and up close her eyes were a tired green with something cautious in them that surfaced the second she saw a man approaching her table alone. Richard said. "I'm sorry to bother you." She didn't answer right away. She waited. "My name is Richard Carver," he continued. "I'm sitting with my son over there." He gestured, and across the room, Nathan raised a hand in the smallest wave. "We were about to order. I noticed you were finishing up. We'd like to buy you dinner, a real one, and we'd like you to come sit with us." She studied him for a long moment. The caution in her eyes didn't diminish. She tensed. "That's kind of you," the woman said. "But I'm fine." Richard kept his voice steady. "I'm sure you are. I'm not asking because I think you're not." Her reply came lower and harder than he'd expected. "Then why are you asking?" That stopped him cold, because he'd expected a yes or a polite no, and she'd given him something harder. She wasn't going to take the easy version of his offer. She wanted to know that he wanted hers. "Because my son asked me to," Richard said. "And he was right to ask." She looked past him toward the booth where Nathan was sitting. Nathan didn't wave. He didn't try to look harmless. He held her gaze calmly, without performance, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to do what the rest of Richard's words hadn't. She looked back at Richard. "My name is Elena," she said. "Elena." Richard gave a single nod. "It's just dinner. You can leave whenever you want." She looked at her empty bowl, then at the door, then back at him. He could see her doing the same calculation he'd done a minute earlier, except hers had different numbers, different stakes, different things she could afford to lose. "I'll pay for my own," Elena said. Richard shook his head. "That's not the offer." Her reply came without hesitation. "It's the only offer I'll accept." He almost said no. Almost insisted the way men like him insisted on most things. But Nathan was watching, and something in the firmness of Elena's voice told him this wasn't pride for pride's sake. This was a line she'd drawn on harder days than this one, and she wasn't going to cross it for a stranger in a clean coat. "Fine," Richard said. "You pay for yours. Come sit with us." She hesitated another second. Then she picked up the bag she'd been guarding all night and stood. Richard led her back to the booth, and behind him he could hear her careful footsteps, not trying to be small. When they reached the table, Nathan slid over to make room. Elena sat across from Richard with her bag in her lap and her hands resting on it. She looked at the menu the way a person looks at something they haven't allowed themselves to consider in a while. Richard watched her and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he'd crossed a line he'd spent years drawing. He still didn't know what was on the other side. He only knew his son had asked him a question, and the answer he'd given was no longer one he could take back. Elena ordered a grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup, the cheapest hot meal on the menu, and placed a crumpled 20-peso bill on the corner of the table before the waitress had even walked away. Richard saw it and said nothing. Nathan saw it too and gave the smallest nod, as if to tell his father not to argue. The conversation that first night didn't go far. Elena answered in short phrases. She measured her bites and kept her bag on her lap for the entire meal. And when the waitress brought the check, Elena slid her bill across the table without ceremony and didn't wait for change. She left before they did, with a quiet thank you that landed somewhere between gratitude and warning. Richard watched her walk out to the parking lot and turn left, away from the row of cars, on foot. Nathan waited until she was out of sight and then said, "She walked here." Richard didn't answer. He set his napkin on his plate. He understood what his son had said without needing the rest of the sentence. For 3 weeks after that, Richard thought about Elena Hayes, perhaps more than he was willing to admit, and then he stopped thinking about her, and then he saw her again. It was at the hardware store on a Saturday morning. She was in the paint aisle with a list in her hand, weighing the prices of 2 cans of primer, the cheaper one and the even cheaper one. She looked up when he stopped at the end of the aisle, and the recognition on her face came with a small, automatic tensing of her shoulders, like she'd been caught doing something. "Mr. Carver," she said. "Richard," he replied. He looked at the cans in her hand and then up at the shelves. "Painting." Elena put one of the cans back on the shelf. "My unit's bathroom has water damage. The property manager said I could fix it myself or wait 6 months." Her voice was even, but Richard could hear the math underneath. The math of a person choosing to spend 40 pesos she didn't have so she wouldn't have to spend the next 6 months looking at a stained wall. He almost offered to send someone. Almost said he knew a guy who did small repairs and could swing by at no cost. He felt the offer rise in him the way offers usually did, automatic and well-intentioned. And then he remembered the crumpled 20 peso bill on the diner table and closed his mouth around it. "It's a good brand," he said instead, pointing at the cheaper can. "I've used it on rentals. It holds up well." Elena looked at him a moment, as if weighing whether the comment was a courtesy or a hint. She seemed to decide it was the former. "Thanks," she said. They stood there a second longer than natural. Then Elena said, before she thought better of it, "My mother's been sick for a while. I'm the only one taking care of her." She didn't elaborate, and Richard understood that the sentence wasn't a request. It was a piece of herself she'd placed on the floor between them, deliberate as a person setting a key on a counter to show she had nothing in her hands. He answered, "I'm sorry to hear that." It was the only thing he could think to say that wasn't more than she'd asked for. They started running into each other after that, at the corner grocery, at the laundromat, near her apartment, at the hardware store again on another errand. None of it was planned, but Richard began to notice he wasn't avoiding those places either. He'd lived in this town long enough to know its rhythm, and Elena's rhythm had begun to intersect with his in places where he hadn't paid attention before. He didn't call it intention. He didn't call it anything. Nathan was the one who said it out loud. They were driving home from the Mason Diner on a Friday night, 3 weeks into what had become a kind of cautious acquaintance, and Nathan turned down the radio. "You know you keep running into her," he said. Richard kept his eyes on the road. "It's a small town." Nathan let that sit a moment. "Sure," he said. "It's a small town." There was no edge in it, but there was no agreement either. And Richard found himself pressing the brake a little harder than necessary at the next stop sign. The 4th time they ran into each other, Elena was at the diner alone again, and Richard and Nathan were already in their booth. She came in to order takeout, saw them, and would have left without saying anything if Nathan hadn't stood up and waved her over. She came with the same cautious step and ate a bowl of soup at their table and paid for herself. Nathan did most of the talking that night, asking her about the book she had under her arm, about the route she walked home, about whether she'd seen the meteor shower the week before. He kept it light without making it shallow. By the end of the meal, Elena had laughed once, briefly, and the waitress, who had begun to know the 3 of them, brought her a refill of water without being asked. Elena began to let them in by inches. She told them she worked 2 jobs, mornings at a dental office answering phones, afternoons cleaning a small medical building near the highway. She told them her mother lived in a small assisted living facility on the outskirts of town and that the cost had been going up every year. She said it the same way she said everything else, without bitterness, as if reciting a fact about the weather. She didn't tell them how close she'd come to losing her apartment in February, but Richard deduced it from a single sentence about how the rent had almost gone up and the way her hand paused over her coffee cup when she said it. The first slip happened on a Wednesday. They were eating at the diner when a man in a navy suit stopped by the booth on his way out. He clapped Richard on the shoulder. "Richard, the Henderson deal closed clean. The whole block. Good work." Richard said something polite back, the kind of thing he said 100 times a year, and the man walked on. When Richard looked up, Elena had set down her fork. She was looking at him differently, not coldly, but the warmth that had been building between them over the past few weeks had dropped by a degree, and he could feel it. "The whole block," Elena repeated. Richard kept his voice even. "Commercial real estate. It's what I do." She gave a slow nod. "I know what you do. You told me you ran a small firm." Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was something worse. It was the tone of a person who just realized she'd been reading a sentence and missed a word in it. Richard said, "I run a small firm. 7 employees. The Henderson building was a one-time thing." Elena looked at him a long second. "Sure," she said, and went back to her soup. The conversation continued, but the air at the table didn't. She didn't stop seeing them, but after that night she began paying for her own meals faster, sometimes before the check arrived. She began turning down the rides Richard had started offering on rainy nights. She began using the word fine more often. And Richard, who had spent his entire career reading the small movements of people across negotiation tables, knew what that meant, and chose to ignore it because he decided somewhere along the way that he was going to help her. He hadn't told anyone, not even Nathan, but he'd decided. The first thing he did was the back rent. Elena had mentioned in passing that the property manager had agreed to waive a late fee from January if she could stay current for the rest of the year. Richard called the management company on a Monday morning, paid the outstanding late fee anonymously through his firm, and asked that they not tell her where it came from. The receptionist hesitated and then agreed, because Richard was the kind of voice on the phone that people said yes to. He hung up and didn't feel guilty. He felt useful, which was a feeling he trusted more than most. The second thing was the job. He had a friend, a woman named Margaret, who ran a small accounting practice in the next town over and had been saying for months that she needed an extra office assistant. Richard called Margaret, described Elena without using her name, and said he thought she'd be a good fit. Margaret asked if there was anything she should know. Richard said, "Pay her well. Treat her like you'd treat anyone else. Don't tell her I called." Margaret laughed and said she hadn't heard him sound like that in years. And Richard didn't ask what she meant. The third thing was smaller and in some ways the worst. Elena had mentioned almost in passing that the assisted living facility was about to raise its monthly fee again, and that her mother had started talking about coming home so Elena wouldn't have to keep paying for it. She said it the way she said most difficult things, like a fact, without asking for anything. Richard called the facility the next morning. He told the billing office he wanted to cover the difference between the old rate and the new one, anonymously, for the next 12 months. The billing officer, who'd been doing this job long enough, said he'd seen this kind of arrangement before and agreed without asking many questions. For a few weeks, things between them were easier than they'd ever been. Elena got the job at Margaret's office. She came to dinner on a Friday and told Richard and Nathan about it with something close to lightness on her face. And Richard ate his meatloaf and said he was glad. He told himself the lightness was the reason, not the lie. Nathan watched them both across the table and said very little. Then, on a Sunday afternoon, Elena told Richard over the phone that the facility had called her, that they'd decided not to raise her mother's rate after all, that some old policy adjustment had come through. She said it with the smallest crack of relief in her voice. Richard made a sound that was meant to be surprise and said he was glad to hear it. He thought he'd pulled it off. He thought he'd pulled it all off. He was a man who'd spent 20 years closing deals quietly and had begun to confuse silence with kindness. The last thing he did, the thing that broke it, was the smallest and the most arrogant. The facility sent Elena a thank you letter the following month, addressed to her as the family contact. The letter mentioned in a line near the end that the facility was grateful for the ongoing generosity of its private donors and listed the dollar amount that had been contributed on her mother's behalf. Elena, reading it at her kitchen table on a Thursday night, recognized the figure as something close to what Richard had once mentioned in passing, as the size of a small charitable donation his firm made each quarter. She might not have been sure, except that she'd spent her entire adult life learning to read the shapes of help that came with strings, and the shape of this one read familiar. She didn't call him. She came to the diner on Friday, as she always did now, but she came earlier than usual and was already sitting in the booth when Richard and Nathan walked in. Richard saw her face and knew before he sat down. Elena waited until they were both in the booth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The diner was full, and that made it worse, because everything she was about to say would be said over the sound of other people's ordinary lives. "I want to ask you something," Elena said, "and I want a straight answer." Richard set his keys on the table. "Okay." She placed the facility's letter on the table between them, the dollar amount visible. "It was you, Richard." He looked at the letter. He thought for half a second about saying no. That half second was enough to tell him everything. "Yes," Richard said. Elena gave a slow nod, like confirming something she'd already known for longer than that night. The late fee on my rent in February. That was you. Richard answered, yes. She continued in the same even voice. The job at Margaret's office. Richard said, I made a call. She made the decision. The job has been yours. Elena nodded again. But I wouldn't have been in that room without you. Richard had no answer for that. He had no answer for any of it. Elena looked at Nathan for a moment, and her face softened briefly before closing again. Then she looked back at Richard. I told you the first night that I'd pay my own way. Do you remember that? Richard said, I remember. Her voice didn't rise. I told you what the rule was, and you decided the rule didn't apply to the parts of my life you weren't watching. Richard said, I was trying to help. Elena's reply was low and complete. I know. That's what makes it worse. She picked up her bag. The waitress was approaching the table with menus in hand, and Elena raised a polite finger, and the waitress veered away. Elena slid out of the booth and stood at the end of it. She didn't look at Richard when she spoke next. She looked at the window, at the gravel lot beyond. You didn't give me a meal, Elena said. You wrote a story about me where I was the person who needed to be saved. And the worst part is, I couldn't even read it before everyone else did. Richard began to say her name. She made a single head movement before he could get it out. I was already doing it, Richard. I was already doing everything, and every time you stepped in, you took a little piece of that away from me, and you didn't even know you were doing it because it cost you nothing. She didn't slam the door when she left. The diner continued its course. The country song on the speaker changed to another country song. Nathan looked at his father across the table, and for the first time in a long time, Richard couldn't read his son's face. He looked down at his own hands. They rested on the table the way Elena's had that first night, neatly, as if holding something that was no longer there. The drive home was silent for a long stretch. Richard kept both hands on the wheel, and Nathan stared out the passenger window at the dark arc of the road. They were nearly at the turn onto their street before Nathan spoke. Dad, he said, his voice even, did you help her or make her feel worse? Richard didn't answer right away. The question wasn't meant to be answered out loud. It was meant to be carried home and set down. He thought about it that night after Nathan went upstairs. He thought about it the next morning at the office when his assistant brought him coffee and he caught himself studying his own hands the way he'd once studied Elena's, and realized he'd been doing that for years, measuring the people around him, deciding which ones he was going to fix without asking. It was a habit he hadn't seen in himself until Elena named it. He thought about his late wife. He thought about how, in the last year of her life, he'd taken over every decision in the house. The bills, the appointments, the slow-shrinking inventory of things she could still choose for herself, and how she'd let him because she was tired. Once, near the end, she'd said, "You're so good at this. I can barely tell which parts of my life are mine anymore." He'd thought at the time she was paying him a compliment. For 3 weeks, Richard didn't see Elena, didn't call her, didn't pass by the laundromat. He stopped going to the Mason diner. He and Nathan ate in the booth by the window without saying her name. The waitress asked once if their friend was coming, and Richard said, "Not tonight." And the waitress didn't ask again. He found in those 3 weeks that the silence at the table was harder to bear than he'd expected. What he did instead was something quieter than he'd ever done. He called Margaret at the accounting office. He told her the truth. That he'd asked her to hire Elena as a favor to him, and that he wanted her to know in case the arrangement needed to be unwound. Margaret listened and then said, "Richard, she's the best assistant I've had in 5 years. What you started, she finished. The job is hers." Richard thanked her and hung up and sat for a long time at his desk. He called the assisted living facility. He asked them to stop the contribution at the end of the current month and to send no further letters mentioning a private donor. He called the property manager and asked that if Elena ever fell behind, she call him only if Elena herself gave her his number. The manager, a tired woman who'd heard many things in her career, said she hadn't expected a man to call to pull back a favor. And Richard said he hadn't expected to be making it. He didn't tell Elena he'd done any of that. He understood, finally, that the point wasn't to confess and be forgiven. The point was to stop being where he'd been. For weeks passed before he saw her again. She was at the grocery store in the produce aisle, reading the label on a bag of rice the way she'd once read price tags on 2 cans of primer. She looked up, and the caution came back to her face, but more slowly this time, like a thing that had to be put on rather than something she was already wearing. Richard stopped at the end of the aisle and didn't approach. Elena said, "I don't want anything. I just wanted to tell you I heard you that night at the diner. I heard you." She didn't answer right away. She put the bag back on the shelf. "Okay," she said. He nodded and turned to go. Her voice came behind him. "Lo." Richard turned. Elena was looking at the rice in her hand, not at him. "If I ever ask," she said, "I'll ask. Until then, please. Just be a person I see sometimes." He answered, "Okay." It was the only answer that was hers to keep, and he gave it back cleanly. 2 months later, she asked. Her car broke down on a Sunday, the 14-year-old sedan she'd been maintaining with patience and a slow mechanic, and she called him from the side of the road. The first thing she said was, "I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking you to drive me home." That was all. Richard said, "I'll be there in 15 minutes." He drove out and picked her up and didn't call the mechanic. When she got out of the truck at her apartment, she said, "Thank you." And he said, "Anytime." And he meant the second word more than the first. After that, things came back slowly. She started joining them at Mason's again, not every week, but enough. She paid for her own meal every time. And Richard stopped trying to talk her out of it, because he'd finally understood that the crumpled 20-peso bill she'd left on the table that first night hadn't been pried. It had been the price of sitting at the table as herself, and he had no business trying to give it back to her. Nearly a year passed on another Tuesday night when the three of them were back in the same booth by the window. The rain was thinning the way it had the night all of this began. The diner was full. A woman came in alone and took the two-top by the back wall, the seat where the lighting was poorest, and ordered a single bowl of soup. Her bag stayed pressed against her hip, the way Richard now knew to look for. Nathan spotted her first. He looked at his father across the table, and this time he didn't lower his voice. "Dad," Nathan said, "can you have dinner with us?" Richard looked at the woman, looked at Elena sitting across from him with her own meal in front of her, and saw that Elena had already noticed. She was watching the woman the way only someone who had once been that woman could. Richard didn't stand up the way he had the first time. He didn't cross the room with the step of a man closing a deal. He set down his fork and said to the table, evenly, "Let's ask her together." Elena met his eyes, and something in her face that had been guarded for a long time loosened just enough. They stood up together.